And welcome into a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. A story that we have been tracking for over 6 months on the Carolina Journal News Hour has finally come to an end. The ongoing saga between Democrat Allison Riggs and Republican Jefferson Griffin for a very important seat on the North Carolina Supreme Court. Jefferson Griffin did concede that race yesterday. To walk us through details this morning, Mitch Kokai, who's been with us this entire time walking us through, joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Mitch, upon our last update, we did learn some details from Judge Richard Myers. He was giving everything a week to kind of rest. What is the big news out of the Griffin camp this morning?
Well, the news is that Jefferson Griffin's legal fight is over. He had, as you mentioned, a week to decide whether to appeal the ruling from Chief District Judge Richard Myers, and he decided not to do so. He basically said that he respected the rulings from the judiciary, and he was going to respect this one and decided not to appeal. So that ends the legal challenge. Justice Allison Riggs, who has been serving on the court throughout this legal controversy, will remain on the court and will serve, unless something else happens and she decides to do something else, will serve a full 8-year term on the court. And so it'll be up to voters in 8 years to decide whether to give Allison Riggs another term or to give someone else that seat on the state Supreme Court. I think probably one of the reasons for this decision is that it would have been very hard for Jefferson Griffin to have secured an outcome different than what Chief District Judge Richard Myers had in this case. The state Supreme Court had spelled out a process that could have addressed somewhere between 1,400 and maybe 5,700 different votes, and whether those votes would count or not in the final tally for the state Supreme Court race. But once the case got back to federal court, Judge Myers basically said, look, it's been too long since this election took place. He did not dispute the state court's ability to say that the targeted votes from overseas and military voters who did not provide photo ID, and people who are identified as never residents, people who checked a box on a voter form saying they've never lived in North Carolina, that those votes could be disqualified. But the judge looked at this cure process and said there were problems with it, that it didn't give equal protection and didn't give due process to those who'd be targeted. And he said because of that reason, and because of the fact that this is now 6 months after the election, the best course of action was just to order the State Board of Elections to certify Riggs as the winner. Myers said perhaps the court, meaning his court, could have come up with some other way of dealing with the problems of the overseas voters with no photo ID or the never residents that would have ensured that people who were qualified to vote did vote, while knocking out the votes of people who were unqualified to vote. But he said that would have been time-consuming, difficult, and 6 months after the election, it was not the best course of action. I think once Jefferson Griffin saw that ruling and saw that the only way he could get it overturned would be to get either the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, or if he tried to take it all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, try to get it overruled. He probably looked at the likelihood of that as being kind of small and decided now it's over. Now, one thing that's interesting in the statement that Jefferson Griffin's campaign released that showed his concession was that he said, hey, despite the fact that I'm not appealing this decision, we did get important rulings from the state courts that said that these voters that I was challenging should have been challenged. But so he said it's not entirely a loss because he secured important rulings from the state court system. But the bottom line is that Allison Riggs is the winner by 734 votes, and Judge Jefferson Griffin will have to go back to serving on the Court of Appeals.
I'm glad you brought up some of those latter comments from Griffin. Mitch, as we look at situations like this, we often say, okay, this individual situation is done, but looking at some of the more broader impacts, there were a lot of serious discussions brought up about some of the ongoings within the North Carolina State Board of Election as it related to driver's license and social security numbers voter ID for individuals out of the country. This very interesting group, never residents. Even though the lawsuit is done, I still think there's many questions for a brand new state board of elections, as we learned yesterday, to deal with in the coming weeks, months, and years.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I would think that one thing that election integrity activists will do is go back to this newly reconstituted state board of elections with its 3-2 Republican majority and say, hey, remember when we came back in late 2023 and said there were all these problems with incomplete voter registrations and that board decided to do nothing about it? How about this new board? Why don't you do something about it? Go back, look at all of these records that have incomplete voter registrations and get the information. And if people don't provide you the information, drop them from the voter rolls. That is something that Republicans have been asking for and conservative activists since late 2023. One suspects that this new state board of elections might be a little bit more inclined to do that. Also then making sure there would be a way to apply the photo ID law to everyone, including military and overseas voters, which would address the second piece of Jefferson Griffin's claim. And then the never residence piece is interesting in that one of the reasons those folks got to be able to vote was that a state law passed more than a decade ago, said that they could vote in the elections. So perhaps the State Board of Elections or people who've been interested in this case go back to the General Assembly and say, the Constitution says you have to live in North Carolina to cast a ballot. You ought to repeal that law or clarify it in some way so that the people who are casting a ballot in a North Carolina election have to actually be residents of North Carolina, not, as is described for most of these never residents, people whose parents may have been North Carolina residents but have never lived in the state themselves and seem to not have any plans to come move to the state.
Mitch, you've been walking us through this process for literally 6 months at this point, keeping us up to date. I just would like to get your brief comment on this. A lot of the social media activity yesterday as it related to this, obviously Democrats happy that they were able to retain this seat on the North Carolina Supreme Court. However, there seemed to be a lot of activist comments, some somehow indicating that Griffin did not necessarily do things properly as it relates to these challenges. Mitch, as you have followed this case unfold, did he follow the proper channels that are given to him and constitutionally protected as he went through this appeals process under your best understanding?
He followed the process that's out there. Now, there are some concerns that are legitimate about the types of voters who were challenged, say with the overseas voters. There are voters who live overseas and cast ballots in all 100 counties in North Carolina. The protests that Jefferson Griffin lodged were only in large Democratic-leaning counties, and that's been a criticism of him throughout. In his defense and on his behalf, remember that when you're filing election challenges, you have a very short time window to deal with. He didn't have time to go to all 100 counties and get information from all 100 county boards of elections about how many voters they had who were overseas who cast ballots without a photo ID. By the time that he was able to file his official election protest, the only information that he had was about 1,400 votes out of Guilford County. But as the lawsuit continued, he was able to get more information that ended up having about 5,500 votes once you added in several other counties. So yes, there is a sense that the counties that he targeted were Democratic-leaning larger counties, but that's also to some extent because of the time limits in getting these ballot challenges in. So there is something to the criticism, but it's not entirely Jefferson Griffin's fault because the State Board of Elections gave him a very limited time. And remember also, the Board of Elections didn't provide much help at all in trying to get to the bottom of some of these issues. Griffin had to go to court initially just to get some information that would help him with his ballot challenges. So if there's going to be some blame placed, you could place some blame potentially with Jefferson Griffin, but a lot of the blame seems to be at the feet of the State Board of Elections under its old leadership, Chairman Alan Hirsch and Director Karen Brinson-Bell, who, as we now know, neither one of them has anything to do with the board anymore.
Mitch, can't thank you enough for walking us through this very, at times, complicated process over the last couple of months. We appreciate the update this morning. Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:15, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get a look at the roadways on a Thursday morning. A look at traffic with Boomer Von Cannon.
Thank you, Nick. You got
It's 522. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. A new bill in the North Carolina General Assembly this morning would provide some relief for North Carolina residents that have been struggling with long wait times at the state's DMV offices. Representative Keith Kidwell from Beaufort County, Jay Adams from Catawba, and Mike Schetzer from Wake County introduced House Bill 821 back a few weeks ago, which seeks to provide a temporary relief by allowing drivers to legally operate vehicles with an expired Class C driver's license for up to 2 years. Class C licenses are the most common type in the state and held by the vast majority of North Carolina drivers. Representative Kidwell told the Carolina Journal at the General Assembly, "We're getting a lot of complaints from constituents. They cannot get into the DMV to get their license renewed. And in some cases, it's taking 2 to 3 months or more to get appointments." The proposal comes as the DMV faces intense scrutiny from both public and government watchdogs. The North Carolina Office of the State Auditor has launched a full-scale audit into the agency, investigating widespread service delays that lawmakers have attributed to chronic understaffing and systematic inefficiencies. The DMV is among the most frequently criticized state agencies, according to legislative leaders. Representative Adams said, quote, "This is not a fix. This is a stopgap measure to accommodate the needs of North Carolinians. Residents shouldn't be punished for the state's backlog. This bill is about giving everyday drivers some breathing room while we work to fix DMV's deeper problems." Contributing to the surge in demand for DMV services are two major factors. One, the rapid population growth in North Carolina, and yesterday's May the 7th Real ID deadline. In response, the DMV has expanded hours at 42 office locations. Many offices are now operating up to 10 hours a day in an attempt to accommodate the influx of appointments and walk-ins. Most offices offered appointments from 7 a.m. to noon and walk-in customers from 12 p.m. to 5 p.m. Former State Representative Paul Tyne, who is now serving as the commissioner of the DMV, emphasized the need to reduce wait times after recently stepping into the role. As this story was written and published yesterday over at carolinajournal.com, according to the online DMV appointment scheduler, there was not a single DMV office in the state that had a single appointment time open. If you are interested in getting some additional details about not only a real ID, but looking at some of those online DMV appointments, you can visit ncdot.gov this morning for additional details. That's ncdov.gov. And we've got more details in this story this morning over on our website as well at carolinajournal.com. Taking a look at some other statewide news this morning across North Carolina, turning our attention back to the Council of State meeting that happened earlier this week. State Treasurer Brad Briner and Controller Nels Roseland are asking the North Carolina Supreme Court to block a lower court ruling favoring a local school system involved in a money dispute with state government. A split state court of appeals panel ruled in April that the Richmond County Board of Education could continue to pursue $272,000 worth of court judgments against the state. That judgment is a decade old, and state lawmakers have never agreed to pay the bill. The Richmond County School Board returned to court in February of last year to renew the judgment, with a trial judge rejecting the state's official motion to dismiss the case in July of 2024. The appeals court 2-1 decision last month allowed the legal proceeding to move forward, with lawyers representing Briner and Roseland saying this decision below is unprecedented. Never before has a North Carolina appellate court allowed an action on a judgment to proceed against state officials acting in their official capacity. By design, an action on a judgment is purely procedural. When a money judgment approaches its 10-year expiration, a creditor may bring a new suit on that judgment or obtain a renewed judgment, therefore extending the period. But where the judgment debtor itself is the state, execution is constitutionally impossible absent a legislative appropriation, according to lawyers for Brad Briner. An earlier state appeals court ruling blocked a trial judge from compelling the treasurer and the controller from paying the Richmond County School District without legislative appropriation, with a court filing adding for the next 7 years, the board took no action. Then the board filed a separate action on debt. The complainant alleges no additional information in this case. Briner and Roseland are seeking a temporary stay along with an order called a writ of supersedes. We've talked about that as it related to the race between Jefferson Griffin and Allison Riggs that would block the appeals court decision from taking effect. The dispute itself stems from a 2011 state law that required defendants convicted of driving with improper equipment in North Carolina to pay a new $50 fee. That fee was designated to cover prison maintenance costs. The Richmond County School Board sued, arguing that the money should instead head to local schools. They did go through that legal process. The state appeals court addressed the initial lawsuit 3 times. First, appellate judges agreed that sovereign immunity did not protect the state from the lawsuit. Second, the appellate judges agreed that with a trial judge that money should head to local schools rather than prison maintenance. And after a second appeal, another trial judge ordered that state officials pay the school $272,300 in fines connected to the 2011 law that still, as of this morning, has not officially been dealt with. In February of 2024, the school system once again returned to court, seeking that a new judgment be entered based on the fact that they did not receive any of the $272,000 in the previous lawsuits that took place. It's a very interesting story as you kind of look at the power battle between local and state governments, especially in the court and legal system. You can get some additional details on that story this morning by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. The headline, Treasurer and Controller ask top NC court to block Richmond schools ruling. You can again read those details at carolinajournal.com, where it's now 5:29, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Another look at the roadways this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
It's 5:36. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Recapping our big breaking news this morning. Republican State Supreme Court candidate Jefferson Griffin is dropping his legal challenge against thousands of votes cast in the November 2024 election against Democrat Allison Riggs. And with that, Griffin has officially conceded the race to Riggs as of yesterday afternoon, some 6 months after the election. Just kind of walking you through how we got here, a federal judge had issued a ruling on Monday ordering the State Board of Elections to certify Riggs the winner. With that, she will serve a full 8-year term on the state's highest court. Final vote count showed Riggs leading Griffin by 734 votes. That was out of more than 5.5 million ballots cast statewide last fall. But for a period of time, Griffin challenged more than 65,000 ballots in a legal dispute that moved through both state and federal court systems. U.S. Chief District Judge Richard Myers issued a 68-page order yet on Monday, ending Griffin's bid to disqualify disputed ballots. Myers had given Griffin 1 week to appeal the decision. With that, the Griffin campaign saying, "While I do not fully agree with the district court's analysis, I respect the court's holding just as I have respected every judicial tribunal that has heard the case thus far. I will not appeal the court's decision." The Griffin wrote, "This effort has always been about upholding the rule of law and making sure that every legal vote in the election is counted." With the candidate adding, "I am thankful that our Supreme Court affirmed the holdings of the Court of Appeals, recognizing that the State Board of Elections failed to follow our Constitution and laws enacted by our General Assembly. The courts have affirmed that voter ID is required for all absentee ballots and that you must be a resident of North Carolina to vote in North Carolina elections. These holdings are very significant for securing our state's election." Myers' order Monday rejected a state Supreme Court decision from mid-April that placed at least 1,600 or so ballots from the fall election in question. The state's highest court endorsed a ballot cure process to deal with some of those disputed ballots. However, as we noted, Judge Richard Myers determined that he would not allow that process to go forward and did notify the State Board of Elections to certify those election results minus a 1-week hold that is now no longer valid, as Griffin has announced he will not be appealing the case and is conceding this election. It's been a wild ride to follow over the last 6 months or so. You can read our final update on this story by visiting our website this morning at carolinajournal.com, where it's now 5:39, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. We officially have a new political makeup of the North Carolina State Board of Elections. Continuing to follow this saga over the last couple of weeks, there was in fact a meeting yesterday where new members were sworn in. To go over those details this morning, Dr. Andy Jackson with the John Locke Foundation joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Andy, for our audience in the past who've been walking through a series of legal challenges as it relates to power over the North Carolina State Board of Elections, it is now State Auditor Dave Bullock, who is a Republican. He's got some new members on the board. You were actually at the meeting yesterday. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, it was pretty straightforward. They opened up, the new board was sworn in. They had a judge come in, administer the oaths. A couple of the members brought in their own Bibles, but there were some Bibles on hand in case you didn't bring your own. And then they went into, almost immediately, they went into closed session. They had to do two things. One, they had to deal with, they say, roughly 20 pieces of litigation that the state board is still dealing with. And I'm sure some of those are probably a couple of years old, but also to deal with personnel matters. In particular, one personnel matter, they were naming a new executive director of the State Board of Elections.
That new director was named as the political landscape of that board has changed. Previously a 3-2 Democrat-controlled board, Andy, now a 3-2 Republican-controlled board, and they did take, at least in their first official public action, naming a new election director, who is now leading that helm over at the State Board of Elections.
Yeah, his name is Sam Hayes. He's somebody that has worked in the General Assembly. He knows the ins and outs of the law, and that's probably going to do him well with all those lawsuits that the state board is dealing with, and also help with the General Assembly, because a lot of members of the General Assembly haven't been pleased with how the State Board of Elections has been conducting its business over the last few years. So something that'll help smooth over that relationship would be welcome.
And Andy, let me ask you about that. There's been a lot of discussion over the State Board of Elections, specifically as we've followed the 6+ month legal battle as it related to the Supreme Court race between Jefferson Griffin and Allison Riggs. There is still a lot of valid criticism and concern over the State Board of Election. Do you think this new board understands that there are still some major concerns that not only lawmakers but the general public has, and maybe looking to try and quell some of those fears and concerns?
I would think so. I'm pretty sure that they're aware of the complaints that have been levied against the old board. For example, one of the big issues in Jefferson Griffin's recent lawsuit that he has just conceded was over folks' registrations that were missing either their last four of the Social Security number or their driver's license number. This is a problem that the State Board of Elections, this had been brought to their attention in a citizen complaint back in 2023. And they had listened to their general counsel, who said, we'll fix our process so this is not a problem going forward, but we're not going to do anything to collect those missing numbers. And so people have been complaining, for a year and a half about that now. And this is part of Griffin's lawsuit. And it's pretty clear from what the courts have said, even though Griffin's lawsuit is now a thing of the past, this issue about these missing numbers isn't going away. And so this new board is going to have to fix that problem, as well as several others that Griffin brought up in his lawsuit.
No, there's no question that there are still some of those questions that are being asked about. In this case of the Griffin lawsuit, it was about 65,000 voters that did have some issues. And Andy, as I understand it, that actually relates to some federal legislation that at this point is over 20 years old, right? The Help American Vote Act from the early 2000s.
Right. So every person who's registered in the state since HAVA was passed, the Help Americans Vote Act, needs to have either their last four of the Social Security or their driver's license associated with that registration. Now, everybody who registered is also assigned a unique number, but the problem is you cannot match that number from the State Board of Elections to other data files. So this doesn't help with helping keep our voter rolls clean, which is the purpose of having those numbers. So that way you could match them up against death files, people who've moved and changed their driver's license could be matched up, but you can't do that if you don't have those numbers. So it makes our elections less secure. And that's the reason that this has come up in the citizen complaints. This is the reason it's come up not just in Jefferson Griffin's lawsuit, but another lawsuit that is still before the courts, and which the state board may have to answer for. So this thing needs to get fixed, and it needs to get fixed as soon as possible. Certainly before the 2026 elections, and preferably before we have municipal elections later this year.
Andy, obviously this morning we're talking about the State Board of Elections, the top-down entity, but maybe for folks that are not familiar with this, every county across the state, all 100 counties, have their own independent Board of Elections that are actually tasked with and responsible for running county elections. And as I understand, some of the legislation passed last year by the General Assembly that changes some of the authorities over the state board, there's also said to be some major impacts in all 100 counties as well.
Yes, the authority to name members of the board that applies to the State Board of Elections, that switched it from being majority Democratic to majority Republican, also applies to all 100 county boards. And really, the county boards are the ones that do most of the work in an election. They're the ones that process the ballots. They're the ones that report the data. I mean, the state board really kind of sets rules and gives advice to the counties. It's really the counties that do it. And all of those are going to be Republican majority boards. They just need the chance to, vet some people and name them.
Absolutely. And Andy, recapping the meeting yesterday, there was an attempt by the outgoing election director and Karen Brinson Bell to make some comments. You were in the room. It wasn't immediately clear for those folks tuning in online. A little bit of a back and forth between the outgoing election director and some new board members. She didn't have a chance to make her comments publicly. Did she make those in the room after the fact?
Yeah, she did. Now, this is really something that's not done. I don't. Other people have told me that this, outgoing directors have never, at the end of a meeting, given a kind of an outgoing statement, an exit interview, if you will. So, but she wanted to do this, make this kind of statement. So it's not normal procedure. And so we had a move. There was a motion to adjourn. They adjourned. The Republican members walked out of the room as Brinson Bell started with her talk. I do notice that nobody turned off her mic or took her mic, so I think the staff went along with that. And so she read out her statement, which include essentially a complaint about her being replaced, which the thing is, this is normal. When you have a changeover in majority, you have a changeover in the executive director. Once again, that's normal business. And so I think when she did that yesterday, it was, I don't know if she was just angry or if she was maybe setting this up to get more drama for her next job. I'm not sure, but it was really unusual.
Thanks for the update this morning from Dr. Andy Jackson with the John Locke Foundation, who joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 546, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Another look at the roadways this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thanks, Nick. Near Hunters.
And you're live.
Good morning again. It's 5:53. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Thursday to you. The North Carolina House of Representatives unanimously passed House Bill 489 earlier this week, a measure aimed at protecting residents from exorbitant ambulance bills by ensuring that insurance companies recognize rates set by local governments. The bill requires health insurance plans to cover out-of-network emergency ambulance services without prior authorization in emergency situations. It passed in a 111-0 vote, aiming to protect citizens from financial burdens for emergency services that they cannot control. State Representative Donnie Loftus, the Republican out of Gaston County, said, quote, "Currently more than half of all ambulance rides include an out-of-network charge. And in fact, 8% of medical debt in the United States is a result of ground ambulances. So this bill is set to address an issue that no surprise billing comes forward down the road for a patient who was transported by an ambulance. In one case, Loftus described a baby who was flown 97 miles via helicopter, and the bill was $97,000. In another case, a COVID patient was flown 86 miles. Those individuals received an $82,000 bill, which was billed to his estate when he unfortunately passed away. Rates charged by counties for emergency medical services, EMS, whether provided directly or through contract providers, must be honored by insurance companies. It sets a minimum reimbursement rate for the service at 100% of the local government's approved rates, or if none exists, either 400% of the Medicare rate or the provider's billed charges. Loftus said citizens should not be responsible for paying this increase because they already pay their taxes in the county that contracts with various EMS services. This will fix some surprise billing for emergency transport when we have no other options. The bill draws on a 2024 Congressional Advisory Committee finding which recommended a payment hierarchy to require insurers to accept state and local EMS rates. You can read some additional details on this legislation this morning by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. And for those that have been struggling to wait in long lines at local DMV offices across the state of North Carolina, a new piece of legislation this morning could solve at least some of those temporary problems. House Bill 821 seeks to provide temporary relief by allowing drivers to legally operate vehicles with an expired license for up to 2 years. That, of course, if you are operating under a Class C license. It is the most common type in the state and held by the vast majority of North Carolina drivers. Your standard driver's license is a Class C license. Representative Keith Kidwell, one of the bill sponsors, told the Carolina Journal, "At the General Assembly, we're getting a lot of complaints from constituents that they cannot get into the DMV to get their license renewed. In some cases, it's taking 2 to 3 months to get appointments or more. The proposal comes as DMV continues to face some intense scrutiny from both the public and government groups. The state auditor's office has launched a full-scale audit of the agency, investigating some of these widespread service delays that lawmakers have attributed to chronic understaffing and some inefficiencies within the office. Representative Jay Adams says this is not a fix. This is a stopgap measure to accommodate the needs of North Carolinians. Residents shouldn't be punished for the state's backlog. This bill is about giving everyday drivers some breathing room while we work to fix the DMV's deeper problems. Of course, contributing to surge within DMV is the population growth that North Carolina continues to see and yesterday's Real ID deadline. In response to that, DMV has expanded hours at 42 of its office locations, with many offices now operating from 7 a.m. all the way until 5 p.m. with walk-in schedule appointments from noon until 5. You can read some additional details on this legislation by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. That's going to do it for the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back with you tomorrow morning, 5 to 6, right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.